Welcome back, everybody, to our next panel session. My name's Julie Hollis. I'm the Secretary General of Eurogeo Surveys, and it's my pleasure to be moderating this panel on how can we increase sustainability and reduce criticality of raw materials. We have 7 people with us, I think, or at least 6. Simon Michaud, who is with us online, Nathan Williams, Sultan Horvath, and Ulrich Krall here in person. Also online, Pasi Alu, Bob Felix Aceti, and Tunda Arisakola. For the purposes of this session, our panelists will first give short presentations, and then I hope we'll have a little bit of time afterwards for questions. You're welcome to ask questions for those of you here in the audience. If you're joining us online, you're also welcome to use Slido to register your questions, and we'll raise those at the end of the presentations. And with Slido, if you use the hashtag #FutureSustainableRM, we'll get those questions. So first of all, I would like to welcome Simon Michaud, who's Associate Professor of Geometallurgy at the Geological Survey of Finland in the Circular Economy Solutions Unit, who will give us the first presentation. Simon, are you with us?
Yes, hello. Can you hear me okay? All right. So the minerals of the future, but which ones? So a case can be made that oil and gas are about to become unreliable, and electric vehicles and hydrogen fuel cell vehicles supported by renewable energy is to replace these petroleum products. So these technology units will harvest renewable energy and do useful work. And existing production and global reserves of minerals, however, is not enough to make the needed quantity of lithium-ion batteries, as per a report I've recently released. Other battery chemistries should be considered and developed in parallel. I'm going to be drawing upon some information from this report. It was released a few months ago. It's public domain and it's available for anyone. So at the end of this report, I'd actually worked out if we were to replace the entire system as we see it now, using 2018 data, all vehicles are now electric vehicles. How many batteries will we need? And then the calculation of the minerals involved. So this is a broad description of what's in a lithium-ion battery released by the Argonne National Laboratory. I think it's based around NMC 811. So if we looked at the percentages in a lithium-ion battery and we projected them into 1 kilogram, how much copper, aluminium, nickel, cobalt, lithium and graphite would we need? And then extrapolate that out against how much we would need for all batteries. Now to remember, this is just for the batteries in the electric vehicles, not the electric vehicles themselves or any other battery consumption like electronics. Conventional applications demand outside lithium-ion batteries are not considered. And you can't recycle what you don't have yet. So very few of these batteries have been manufactured compared to how much we need. So this will have to come from a mining source. So let's look at mining. This table shows in 2018, the global annual production of these metals. Column in the middle, if we're to phase out fossil fuels and if we were to replace all ICE vehicles with electric vehicles, we will need 2.8 billion, with a B, tons of lithium-ion batteries. And if we were to separate that out into the metals, you see that middle column. Now, if we were to produce at 2018 levels of capacity, how many years will we need to produce that amount of metal? So you see the number of years. We could probably do okay with aluminium and at a stretch copper if we spread it over a long enough time. But when you look to nickel, cobalt, lithium and graphite, we're talking hundreds of years now. So the obvious answer to this is obviously we need to open more mines. We've got plenty of reserves. Let's look at those reserves. This is the reserves as stated in 2018 up against what we is projected with what we need. And as you can see, there's not enough reserves in there. And even if we did have enough, do we have the time to open these mines? Remembering, for every 1,000 deposits discovered, only 1 or 2 become mines. Currently, it takes about 20 years to develop a mine from a discovered deposit. And for every 10 mines, 2 or 3 lose money and shut down. It's a tough game. The reason this report was written was the push to actually have lithium-ion battery chemistry looked at the exclusion of everything else. At this point, though, I would propose that we look at other chemistries, and there are others. So this graph is from the reference down the bottom, and it looks at the theoretical capability to make batteries of the theoretical gravimetrical energy density and the theoretical volumetric energy density. And as you can see, lithium-ion batteries in the bottom left-hand corner. There's lots of others we can make batteries out of them. So we can, for example, make batteries out of fluoride, the fluoride in your toothpaste, or zinc air batteries, or chloride ion batteries. Now, at the moment, this is what we pass around that show that lithium-ion batteries are better in the current market. This tells me that there is enormous potential that can actually sort of be developed both in lithium-ion batteries, but also lots of other minerals. And those minerals, there is no perceived shortages at all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon. Okay, we will continue by moving straight on to the next speaker, who is Nathan Williams. He's a Canadian entrepreneur living in Berlin. He's the founder and CEO of MindSpider, an energy-efficient public blockchain for supply chain traceability in the extractive industries. Welcome, Nathan.
Thank you very much. I want to talk a little bit about incentives today, because when we're talking about global CRM and using UNFC and UNRMS, the question is, how do we get good data? How do we keep it up to date? So my background is we create digital product passports for mineral traceability, and so that's sort of tangentially related to today. But what I want to talk about is, first, let's look at UNFC. We've heard it defined a couple of ways today. It is a way of standardizing the classification of mineral reserves. There are 14 different categories, and what I found from working in different working groups is that making sure that the understanding of what we are trying to accomplish with UNFC is clear is important, because it's very easy to get lost in the details. When you're working in a mine, when you're working in a geological survey, you've got access to expert level data, which is very, very detailed. But when you're talking about UNFC, the idea is to harmonize, right? And so this is a lowest common denominator to try and get an understanding of high-level decisions that can be made about mineral reserves. Now, when we're talking about UNRMS, we're defining it, it's a voluntary global standard for sustainable integrated resource management, okay? So it's the idea that you would use this UNFC harmonized data to manage resources. It would be voluntary, but what does this mean from a practical standpoint? I've talked to a number of people, both who are working on UNRMS, different working groups, and from an aspirational standpoint, it's very clear. We want to have a better way of managing resources globally. People can opt in, people can benefit from this, and we can manage resources effectively for the needs of tomorrow. But the question is, practically, what does this mean? And often people are confused about how their detailed working groups fit into the global vision of the UNRMS. And so I like to think about it as another iteration of a database that people will be able to access. And I know we've had databases in the past that haven't accomplished what they want to do. This is a very complex issue. But if we start to think about the use of a database in terms of the use cases that it would be used for, then instead of just collecting data that would be for every use case, but think of what are the high-level decisions of management that we want to accomplish, and how can we support that with as little data as possible, then we can start to think of how a practical implementation can be designed in order to meet those needs. So let's talk about how we can collect that data. Most of the data in previous database iterations has been collected top-down, right? So we set up a system or set up a group of people who start to collect the data. They do surveys, they do maps from existing technical reports in various formats and try to get it into a database that is often very complicated for decision makers to use. So what I want to talk about is, what about the idea of incentivizing data collection from the bottom up? How do we incentivize companies instead of all of the decision makers to submit this type of data so that it can regularly stay up to date? So one approach is to incorporate data collection into something that benefits the mines themselves, because the data that goes into that comes from a mine, the data that comes from a mineral reserve, is going to change very regularly. Now imagine you had some sort of portal or some sort of product passport where companies can show, hey, our materials are produced in a responsible way, or they have an easier time getting across borders, or there's an easier way for them to distinguish themselves in the grander market. Then they have a benefit for supplying data. Now if you incorporate something like Unfc in their technical reports, or you have some sort of automated mapping, you can reduce the burden for a mine to submit this type of data. You're also going to have the need to incentivize countries to participate, and so then you need some sort of mechanism where the countries that participate and provide data or agree to participate in the UNFC formatting and supply data to the UNRMS would be able to get the benefit of actually using the power of the UNRMS for themselves. So it's a you contribute, you get out of it. Sort of a Wikipedia model is what we're imagining. So very quickly, a dashboard, obviously it would need to be very high level, and I think that part of the problem that we've run into with previous databases is that if you design something that's for an expert, it's going to have a level of detail that you need to go through and have a level of understanding that is not relevant to a decision maker that might be using this for a higher level of decision. And so it's important that when we're thinking of this and designing dashboards, we think of maps, we think of the broad categories, and trying to use this in as good a way as possible. And I want to leave with the thought that with small successes, we can start to generate momentum for bigger ones. And I would love to see us move from the aspirational to the practical by doing some practical implementations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well done on keeping that right in 5 minutes, and a very good point on trying to promote the benefit to the users who are actually submitting the data. Okay, so our next speaker is Dr. Sultan Horvath. He's a geologist, head of Department of Mineral Resource Management and Concession Affairs in the Mining and Geological Survey of Hungary. He represents Eurogeo Surveys in the UNECE Expert Group on Resource Management and is a member of the UNECE Anthropogenic Resource Working Group. Thank you.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for the invitation to this Sustainable Resource Management panel discussion. My class is to introduce the role of data and information in support of policy, finance and decision making. In order to specify the topic here, I'm going to talk about geological, geoscientific and mining related data and information. On this picture, one of the governing factors is policy, that is not only framework but collection of measures to resource management. Resource management needs proper and sufficient geological data and information resources and reserves, exploration, exploitation, and also for future mining areas. Different policies like raw materials, environmental and land use planning influence mining activity. However, mining is not only business but service for social needs, and research data is fundamental. Either governments or banks provide financial support, proper knowledge is needed for mineral reserves or for resources for further development. Governments and companies need also to look at risks. Pre-feasibility and feasibility studies with sufficient data and the involvement of competent persons are essential. Eurogeo Surveys provides harmonized raw materials data for the main part of Europe. The raw material information system maintained by the European Commission Joint Research Center has also linked to EGS database. Geological and mining-related data is essential to decision on short, medium, and long-term development plans, and investments nowadays taking into account the Green Deal objectives, green and digitized transition with energy resource efficiency and mitigation of import dependency. In order to increase the public acceptance, responsible mining is the decision of companies, while sustainable mining is being developed by the European Commission with stakeholders. By the integration of the UNFC and UNRMS concepts into the resource management, sustainable development goals can be achieved. Why? Because it handles degree of confidence, social, environmental, and technological considerations. By using bridging between CRISCO type reporting codes, national classification, and UNFC, daily and long-term decisions will be supported for government and even for large companies. EGS members are committed to streamline the methodology for using UNFC and based on it to cover Europe with UNFC data as much as is possible. One of the important programs, the GEORA, has just finished successfully. GEORA raw material projects process more than 40,000 individual raw material inputs, including active mines and quarries, historical mine sites, and information to identify future mining areas on the land and offshore areas on the European Sea. Inspire compliant data is stored in the Minerals for EU database, which is part of the European Geodata infrastructure, as Julie mentioned. Mintel for EU project, among others, provided around 30 case studies with UNFC. Pashi Liu will speak about it more details. And FRAME stands for Strategic and Critical Minerals. FRAME and Mindesi submit new information to help identify future mining areas, onshore and offshore areas where around 700 mineral occurrences were identified. Eurolithos takes into account Europe's great cultural heritage, which is even literally set in stone. In the future, the EGDI will be the most comprehensive database, including geoscientific and reserve-related datasets with all the related knowledge base. In the frame of the planned Geological Service for Europe, the EGDI will be maintained and will be useful for policy, finance, and industrial decision-making. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sultan. Okay, great. Well, we'll move on now to Pasi Alu, who is replacing Kari Aslakson Asli, who unfortunately couldn't join us today. Pasi is a senior scientist at the Geological Survey of Finland and adjunct professor at the University of Turku, and for more than 20 years has worked on mineral deposit databases, mineral resources, mineral raw material supply, critical raw materials, and the UNFC mineral resource classification issues. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. So may I have my slides on? Thank you. And there's been so much talk of about UNFC in general, so I don't go into that details or general topics at all, but look at what we found out with case studies in the Mintel. So next slide, please. So we had these 19 case studies from 9 countries across Europe, and what we did find there essentially are the things that when resource or reserve is critical compliant, it's easy to bridge into UNFC categories. And also another thing is that really all these case studies are telling that any resource can be classified into UNFC categories. So that's the easiest. There are plenty of things that are not that straightforward. How to deal with old data information, what is the current relevance of those? There might be recent resource information, but it's not critical compliant, and yet evaluators may categorize it into UNFC classes as it were like an CRISCO compliant resource. So how to deal with that? And then a big question is that we just don't get the data, we don't get the information. It's not accessible even to as confidential format to a government organization. Is especially big issue with certain industrial minerals, companies not listed anywhere. Issue might be that the national legislation is not demanding to report any resource to a government authority, and then there are simply practices of hiding the data for whatsoever reasons there might be. I don't know. And then when going through all these case studies, as we did, it so much depends on the evaluator how they really quantify resources, how they interpret the UNFC 3-axis criteria to give an UNFC class for a resource, be that really localized, single deposit, or more of something regional. Next slide, please. So what to do with then is what we suggest. They naturally have to be national and also international policy frameworks to overcome the poor data availability, at least so at sort of aggregated national level. And then, well, we do have good guidelines for UNFC, but yet there are lots of cases, issues where these guidelines are not really enough to get sort of really harmonized, consistent categorization between evaluators, between countries as well. So we strongly suggest that there should be a permanent body organizing and supporting training across all countries. All organizations that use the UNFC code get all the possible evaluators involved, get the message across, go through various, might be very surprisingly strange-looking cases of resources, what to do with them, so that we really get things sorted out in a consistent, harmonized way. This is really important. Otherwise, the information we collect is not so useful for national resource accounting, and policymakers, decision makers may find out that they can't rely on the information we collect. So the next slide, please. So this is the message from the Mental for European Union Project Work Package 4. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and for that insight into some of those case studies. We'll move straight on now to Ulrich Kral. He has a background in civil engineering and holds a waste expert position at the Waste and Material Flow Management Team of the Environment Agency of Austria. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. In the first talk this morning given by Harry Tulsidas from UNEC, he pointed out that the SDGs can only be achieved with a sustainable resource management that is globally accepted and implemented on national level. And of course, this global resource management includes the sustainable management of natural resources, so resources that are extracted from Earth, from the geosphere, and it also includes the management of secondary raw materials, or also so-called anthropogenic resources. And in my talk today, I introduce a little bit on focus on the anthropogenic resource management in the context of the UN framework classification for resources. And if we have a closer focus to critical raw materials, you know that the total CRM demand consists of primary critical raw materials and of secondary raw materials or recycled critical raw materials. And on the right-hand side, you see a figure that was published by the GRC in 2018, and it shows the contribution of the recycled critical raw materials to the total critical raw material demand. And the recycling content in the final products put on market range between 0 and 44%. And the question is, if there is still a potential to increase the share of recyclables within the products put on market. The first question is, why should this be done? If we increase recycling, this enhances the supply security, especially if it's done in Europe, because Europe will be more independent from sources overseas. The second is that recycling in general contributes to a sustainable production, because the energy demand for recycling is much lower compared to primary production, and this saves CO2 emissions and also water. And the third argument is that, of course, recycling and recovery in Europe creates jobs. How to increase recycling? Of course, at the beginning of each value chain stands the recovery of materials. And this is also the case for secondary raw materials. And the generation and production of secondary raw materials requires the development of sustainable recovery projects. Of course, developing a sustainable recovery project affects several stakeholders, and these are also the stakeholders that are affected by the UNFC. They have an information need when it comes to the development of a recovery project. On the one hand, these are governments who want to manage their resources and guarantee a secure, affordable, and sustainable supply. It's the wider society that wants to be informed about the environmental, social, and economic impacts. It's the industry that needs the security of supply to establish the new technologies for the energy transition. And it also needs this information to communicate with the shareholders and the stakeholders to get investments, for instance. And it's the financial community who is interested in the development of recycling projects, and they need this information to decrease investment risks, to avoid stranded investments. And of course, on the other hand, they also need green investment promotion tools, and I think UNFC is an appropriate way to provide this information for investors too, to go to the client and go to the market with this information. And of course, these stakeholders require this information, and this information is provided through the application of UNFC. As already mentioned, it communicates the availability of mineral and energy resources on the project base. And there is a very long tradition in classifying mineral resources, for instance, over more than 100 years. And there is less experience for resource classification of secondary raw materials. But in 2018, the UNEC Expert Group of Resource Management expanded the scope, and now the anthropogenic resources are also under the umbrella of the UNFC. And this allows comparable estimates of recovery projects from the mining sector to the recycling sector on a common ground, and to make reasonable decisions on the diversification of sources of supply between primary and secondary. Let me briefly introduce two applications of the UNFC. Very quickly, there are a couple of examples available. One is for residues from extractive industries in Portugal. The study was carried out by Mr. Suppes and Soraya Heusaspelcher from Germany, and they used the UNFC to demonstrate the different scenarios and the effects on the viability of the recycling project. I don't want to go into the detail, but they defined a rehabilitation scenario, a recovery scenario, and an advanced recovery scenario to show the effects on the viability of the recovery project. The second example is material recovery from waste incineration residues in the canton of Zurich in Switzerland. In this case, UNFC was used to monitor the development or progression of the recycling project from the time of the initial idea in 2003 to the final production stage in 2014. And you see different technology pathways, 3 different ones, and the viability of these technology pathways. And this helps to understand governmental processes, environmental impacts, and how to overcome barriers over the lifetime during the progression of a recycling project. My final slide is the sustainable management of anthropogenic resources. Of course, each individual case study is a snapshot in time for a specific geographic area, but I think it needs a more systematic approach to manage anthropogenic resources in a sustainable manner. And there was a 4 years expert network in Europe funded by the European Coast Association with partners from more than 25 countries in Europe, and they developed a roadmap for sustainable management of resources. And I want just to point out that next to the case studies, the expert group feels that there is also a need for harmonizing and development of anthropogenic resource assessment. So not only the classification is used to communicate the results of their assessment, but there's a wide range of different assessment methodologies, for instance, when it comes to the sampling of waste, to detection of recoverable quantities. This is currently not standardized across Europe and should be done in the future. As it is currently practiced in the mining sector, the anthropogenic resource sector, recycling sector, would also need, let's say, a quality assurance system for the forecasts of recoverable quantities. This is called more or less quality assurance systems, but it means that there are competent persons present that have the knowledge, the capability to perform resource forecast studies, as in the mining sector. Of course, it needs an information system, as already presented, for instance, for Sweden, which is currently practiced for the CRMs in deposits and in tailings. I think such a system is also needed for secondary raw materials, potentially at the scoreboard at the GRC. And the last point is, I think this is also of most important, the integration of UNFC into the national policy cycles, including secondary raw materials in combination with the primary raw materials. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ulrich, for that insight. And we'll move on now to our last speaker, Bob Felix Aceti. He works as manager in operations and compliance at the Petroleum Authority of Uganda. He's a member of the African Union AMREC working group, charged with developing and promoting the African Minerals and Energy Resource Classification and Management System, AMREC. I'm not sure if Tundo Arascola is also here with us, but Bob Felix will be presenting on behalf of both of them. Thank you, Bob.
Thank you, moderator. Indeed, Tunde and I should have been here today, but unfortunately, Tunde couldn't make it due to unavoidable circumstance. And I'm going to make the presentation on behalf of the AMREC Technical Working Group. Next slide, please. As an outline, basically, I'll just give you a brief introduction and overview and a 3-stage approach to how we tend to apply AMREC in Africa, and then I'll give you a conclusion. Next, please. As an introduction, I think if there's anything that we have learned from the Sustainable Development Goals is that we live in a shared earth. What that basically means is that no one should be left behind. So we should be moving together as sustainably in every effort that we look towards development of our continent and our earth. The other one is that we have a global aspiration so that in living in a much better world. And so we come up with these 17 Sustainable Development Goals so that no one is left behind, and we move together in order to develop and sustainably our resources. But one thing that we have learned over time is the question of whether the effort towards achievement of sustainable development goal is actually concerted. And what we see around the world is that every region may have particularly different pressing issues that determine which of the sustainable development goals is probably more important at a time. If you talk to the Maldives, for example, they will be more preoccupied with how climate action is being taken by the world because they are more threatened perhaps than another part of the world that could be having challenges to do with clean energy and clean energy like in Europe. For example, if you look at Africa, we'll probably be preoccupied with taking people out of poverty. So in terms of concerted effort, different regions will have perhaps a different approach to sustainable development goal. But aspiration-wise, we should be able to achieve this together as a globe. Can we go to the next, please? Now, to illustrate this, I'm just using this as a single example of how the cobalt supply chain from DRC looks like. In order to demonstrate how sustainability, the aspiration of sustainability from the African perspective is concerned. Take, for instance, cobalt being supplied from DRC, in the tune of over 50%. And most of these, you'll find that actually in areas that are quite remote and mostly artisanal miners are like 20%, constitute 20% of those who are preoccupied with the mining of this very important resource. And these people are paid quite low wages, in less than $2 a day for work in the cobalt mines. And where does the raw material then goes? You find that this raw material eventually end up in Asian countries where they had a value to it and process it. The component producers are in Asia, and then the product, the end users and consumers are in Europe and the USA. The question then we ask today is this type of supply chain of a very precious raw material that the world needs, is it really sustainable? Because if Africa would be preoccupied with achieving Sustainable Development Goal 1, which is taking people out of poverty, then everyone else should be able to pay a fair share of the resources that comes from Africa. And that will help sustainably achieving the SDGs and enabling Africa to get out of poverty. And that's precisely what informed the development of AMREC. So next slide, please. So as an overview of AMREC, what we basically see here, AMREC has been developed, of course, aligning it to what we call the Africa Mining Vision and Agenda 2063, which is an agenda for the kind of Africa we want, a prosperous continent, and the Sustainable Development Goals. And it's based on the UNFC principles, generic specification, but also now we are adopting and we are working towards ensuring that the UN resource management system actually speaks to the aspirations and the dreams of African continent as a whole. And it's a single classification and management system for the management of natural resources in Africa. It goes back to what I mentioned before, that if we have to have a sustainable resource management in Africa, then we must be able to integrate it into an acceptable global tool, which AMREC is trying to achieve. The next slide, please. Now, to illustrate the application of AMREC in the continent, I will use a three-stage approach. And what do we see in this three-stage approach? In stage one, we basically do what we have always done: identify a resource, a resource prospect, evaluate it, estimate it, and then classify it. Here, I use a real project, actually a project that we carried out in one of the African continents. I've used the name Project A, Project B, Project C just for confidentiality, but it's actually real results of a pilot UNFC classification of projects that we carried out about 2 years ago. So you can see in this result that we have, of course, most of you are already familiar with the the three-dimensional framework of UNFC. The EFG axis subclass classification of Project A is justified, Project B development pending, Project C development on, and Project D is an exploration project. So what happens is that when we use this same natural process that we usually in estimating and classifying resources, then we need to have something complementary to this. And that is where the resource management component of AMREC comes into play. Next slide, please. In the next slide, what we basically see is that we apply the good principles of resource management. In this case, I'm showing you a pilot project that we did in Uganda. We studied 4 different projects, 2 gold mine, 1 tin mine, 1 salt mining project in Uganda, and we assessed them against what we call critical controlling factors that AMREC advocates for. One of them is the project milestone and decision gate, value addition and beneficiation, economic diversification, comprehensive resource recovery, and zero waste concept. These are primary concepts that are actually embedded within the pillars in the UNRMS. And so you can see critically from this result, which is basically giving you a qualitative, aggregated qualitative result of what we carried out and assessed, that value addition, for example, everything, all those 4 projects fall below expectations. And if you look at some of the other, critical controlling factors, a number of them also, a number of the projects fall below expectations. So how do you use this result then in as a complementary result with the UNFC to make decisions? Go to the next slide, please. In the next slide, what we basically now see is a combination of results from the UNFC classification and the resource management controlling factors that determines decision. So in this case, now we look at this project and say project A with the classification of EFG 1.1, 1.3, and 1 in terms of EFG. If we assess this against the critical controlling factors that determine sustainable development of that resource, is it still justified for development? Can we still classify Project B as development pending? Can we still classify Project C as development for? Now, the answers to this question definitely depend on how much weight you attach to each of those controlling factors and how much, or value for that matter, that you attach to each of these controlling factors. So if value addition, as critical as it is in the African continent case, for example, the cobalt that I mentioned in DRC, we would probably argue and say, why shouldn't we add value in the resource in Congo so that we can supply the product to the rest of the world? And that is a question that each country or each continent or EU for this matter will have to make, and have to make a decision on whether they would want to invest in production or ferry out raw material. And that question is the critical question in sustainable development in as far as the African continent is concerned. The next slide, please. In conclusion, therefore, I would like to say that the AMREC system is a comprehensive assessment system for projects, and it aims towards the sustainable development of the natural resources. And this is definitely aimed at attaining the aspirations of the Africa Mining Vision and the SDGs. And of course, the AMREC is embedded under the African Minerals Development Center business plan, which is ready for implementation beginning this year. AMREC has been adopted by the STC, which is the Special Technical Committee and the Council of Ministers of the African Union this last September, 2nd of September this year, and it's ready to be submitted to the summit in January 2022. With this, I beg to stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bob Felix, for those insights. I am conscious that we have already run over time, but do we have any questions? We do have some questions on Slido. Okay, so the first question we have here is why Europe does not plan or invest in biofuels, helping a slower transition to electronic vehicles. Are there any of the panelists who would like to weigh in on that question? I'm not sure that...
Yes, I can.
Yes? Is that passing?
So in my... there's an echo there. Is everything all right? Okay, in the link that I actually prepared and sent in that report, I examined the capacity for extending biofuels to replace all existing petroleum consumption. And the simple answer is the planet cannot sustain producing that much biomass. We're not only in direct competition with food production, we're also in competition with other land use like forestry. So biofuels may be the most sensible way to keep the aviation industry going, and biomass may be the best way to keep the plastics industry going. So it is absolutely necessary, but seeing it as a solution to replace ICE vehicles is actually not feasible. I'm happy to discuss this further with anyone in the audience if they so choose.
Thank you very much, Simon, for that one. I'll just address the second question that we had there as well, if we can raise that again, and then we might break for lunch. UNFC, UNRMS are tools that are data intensive. In many cases, data doesn't exist as it is not collected by industry or governments. How do we ensure that data is available? And I think this was touched on by at least a couple of our speakers. Is there anyone who'd like to comment there?
So one of the big things that we have to keep in mind when we're doing data collection is, first of all, how do we make sure that the database doesn't just languish? Like if we invest money into a database and then it gets built, it gets put there, and then 5 years later, all of the data is out of date. You know, this is a big problem in the data industry. The only real way to get around this is to constantly update it. And the only way to constantly update it, you have two options. You either put money into it constantly, or you build a business model around it, so you find ways that the companies, countries, or whoever benefits from it ends up putting the data in. Now, when the data doesn't exist in the first place, you've got to find incentives for companies and countries to put it in there. Now, that could mean tying this type of geological data to some sort of marketing portal or data portal, so that companies, to access it, would have to provide data, or to have some way of tying it to trade agreements, so that countries that join in with UNFC would have an easier time selling into the European Union, for example. But realistically, there's no way around that. Someone's got to collect the data, and it's an open problem today.
Thank you. Anyone else have a comment there? Zoltan?
Thank you. Earlier it was mentioned that the legislative background in some cases should be developed in order to manage to gather, collect proper data for raw materials. So as a positive example, I can say that if a country or member state has proper data for mineral resources, reserves, and the state of exploration areas or mines, in this case, UNFC can be used easily. In other cases, the data collection should be improved. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And so that you can all get away and have something to eat now, I think we'll call it there. But thank you very much for all the panelists and also for our audience for engaging and sending through those questions. Thank you very much.